Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Russia invades Ukraine. In the capital, helicopter attacks capture the airports, and Russian troops are reportedly inbound.
Then you tell us, I don't want a ceasefire. I don't want a ceasefire.
До угоди про закінчення війни ще дуже далеко. Ніхто всі ці кроки не розпочав.
The crisis in Ukraine following the Russian invasion deepens even further. Millions of refugees, economic collapse, and ever more signs of a shattered Ukraine emerging at the epicenter of a reckoning in the so-called First World. When peace finally does arrive, what will it look like? But before we answer that, it's OPSEC time. Let me show you something real quick. Google your name. Odds are some of your personal information comes up, right? If I search my name, it's just my public social media accounts. Want to know why? Because I use Aura, the sponsor of today's video. If you've ever wondered why you're constantly harassed by spam calls, texts, and emails, here's why. There are companies called data brokers whose sole purpose is to find and sell your data. They do it without your consent, and they make billions selling it to marketers, scammers, and even stalkers. And while they're legally required to remove your info if you ask, they make the process confusing and difficult on purpose. This is why I'm always recommending Aura to family and friends. They take care of everything for you. They remove your data from these sites, and they keep it removed. Aura is an all-in-one digital security tool. You may already use some other basic app, but not using Aura is like locking the front door, but leaving the back door wide open. And Aura doesn't just fight data brokers. They alert you if your personal data is found on the dark web, they provide real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 identity theft monitoring, secure VPN, antivirus, parental controls, password manager, credit checker, and more. And if somehow something does happen, Aura includes $5 million in identity theft insurance, and they have US-based fraud experts on call 24/7. If you're anything like me, I'm sure you're sick and tired of these stupid, evil little companies stealing your personal information and using it to make a quick buck. That's why I use Aura. It keeps me and my family safe online. If you're ready to protect your data, you can get 2 weeks absolutely free when you use our link. During those 2 weeks, you'll see exactly where your data is being leaked and who's doing it. Give it a try. I promise you'll appreciate the peace of mind. Now, back to the show. Russia's attempt to annex the Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia oblasts reflects a deliberate strategy to cement territorial gains under the guise of constitutional legitimacy. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has unequivocally stated that these regions are, quote, written into the constitution as Russian territory, despite Moscow's incomplete military control of those areas at time of writing. This is consistent with Putin's broader historical revisionism, which frames Ukraine as an illegitimate pseudo-state carved from Russian lands during the Soviet era. His 2021 essay explicitly rejects Ukraine's sovereignty, arguing that the Bolshevik leaders, quote, chopped the country into pieces and robbed Russia of historical claims, which include the 1954 transfer of Crimea to Ukraine. He also claims the Minsk agreements are the only viable framework for peace, but says they've been sabotaged by Western-backed Russophobia and Kyiv's unwillingness to accept the autonomy of the Donbass. Western rejection of these claims has only hardened Moscow's resolve, with Belarus increasingly leveraged to help consolidate control. Putin is also demanding that Ukraine demilitarize and become fully neutral to sever the post-Maidan Ukrainian ties to NATO and the EU. The 2023 foreign policy concept of Russia emphasizes, quote, indivisible security, and rejects Western domination while bolstering alliances like the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and the EAEU, the Eurasian Economic Union. Putin's rhetoric frames all Ukrainian resistance as a foreign ploy, accusing unnamed perpetrators that are reasonably and broadly assumed to be the West to manipulate Kyiv into committing, quote, ethnic cleansing against Russians within Ukraine. To be clear, there has been repression of Russians and the Russian language in Ukraine, along with political suppression of minority interests. However, Russia is using these as a pretext to further their own interests, as the West is using Ukraine to bolster their geopolitical standing, weaken Russia militarily and economically, and benefit from the ruthless exploitation of Ukrainian resources and labor. Control of the Black Sea, especially through Odessa, is central to securing resources and dominating regional trade for all sides involved, with Moscow prioritizing, quote, sovereign rights over energy pipelines and trade routes. Belarus serves as a critical enabler since its government grants Russia military basing, as well as some important economic control and a springboard for possible hybrid attacks, forcing Ukraine to divert its limited, mostly Western-provided resources to its northern border. Analysts in the West, warning of real or imagined Russian attacks for nearly a century now, claim that Belarus's close ties with Moscow are reshaping Eastern Europe's security landscape, with NATO members fortifying their borders against potential Russian military incursion. Possibly worst of all for Ukraine is the credibility crisis NATO faces in Eastern Europe as it demands guarantees against Russian military expansion. Meanwhile, Western Europe seeks détente, but only in public. Putin consistently blames the US and EU for sabotaging Ukraine-Russia relations, framing Western loans and anti-corruption reforms as tools to perpetuate dependency. And as uncomfortable as it may be for some Western viewers, there's significant truth in that analysis, as Hakim has shown in his videos here. The so-called Finlandization proposal, the creation of a neutral Ukraine integrated economically with Russia and the EU, is dismissed as naive by claiming the Russian government will insist on control over Kyiv's alliances. Meanwhile, the West is concerned about Russia's Black Sea ambitions and Belarusian integration, seeing them as threatening the destabilization of Moldova and Georgia, creating non-aligned buffer zones. The West has not sat quietly during these developments, instead supporting their own geopolitical interests through semi-legitimate or not-so-legitimate governments in the former Soviet sphere of influence. Putin's narrative of Russians and Ukrainians comprising one people is fundamental to his rejection of Ukrainian statehood, framing NATO's presence as a threat to traditional, that is, Eastern Orthodox Christian, Russian values. However, this is only an ideological cover for legitimate security concerns along Russia's western borders, which Russia has publicly emphasized since the illegal dissolution of the USSR. This ideological battleground imperils Western unity as Eastern members like Poland and Lithuania fortify borders, including weaponized migration policies. NATO's pivot towards Asia, driven by the US focus on Taiwan, risks further eroding European security as Russia and the US use spheres of influence rhetoric to add legitimacy to military aggression. Prior to the invasion, 52% of Ukraine's energy came from its 4 functioning nuclear power plants. However, following the seizure of the 6-gigawatt Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Ukraine's remaining 9 reactors now operate at a total capacity of just short of 8 gigawatts. Russian military forces have avoided directly striking nuclear reactors, but they have systematically targeted transformer substations, crippling the distribution of energy and posing other serious nuclear safety risks since disconnection from off-site power can compromise reactor systems, often forcing emergency shutdowns. Ukraine's energy grid used to have a transmission capacity of 56 gigawatts, but this has been degraded to near parity with its generating capacity, leaving little ability to reroute energy when parts of the grid are destroyed. Beyond nuclear power, hydro and thermal plants have also been extensively targeted. So far, hydro plants have remained more resilient, while thermal power generation has been significantly crippled, putting further strain on Ukraine's energy independence. One point of pride for Ukraine is its agriculture. Known as the breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine is responsible for exporting more than 54% of globally traded wheat, barley, and oats. Of course, this hasn't escaped the ravages of war either. This is very bad news for countries like Egypt and Lebanon, which rely on Ukraine for 85% and 81% of their wheat imports respectively. The war has pushed 13 million more people into undernourishment, with countries like Guinea-Bissau and Somalia bearing the brunt of the crisis. Winter crop yields in Ukraine have plummeted, with reductions of 5.42 million tons compared to 2021, and war losses could push this figure to over 15 million tons, enough to feed 76 million adults for a year. The conflict has also disrupted farmland management, such as fertilization and irrigation, leading to even less grain production. The West's exploitation of Ukraine had been, for a time, more subdued, hidden under the guise of aid and reform. That changed drastically with the start of the second Trump term. Shortly after taking office, the Trump administration pressured Ukraine to sign a lucrative, for the US, mining deal for critical minerals like lithium and titanium as repayment for already provided aid. President Zelensky initially resisted these privatization demands, which prompted the US to freeze all aid and intelligence sharing, including access to satellite imagery crucial for planning attacks and monitoring Russian movements. The European Union, meanwhile, has tied loans to austerity mandates and so-called anti-corruption, read pro-Western NGO and political intervention, reforms, similar to how they treat the Global South. These are framed as structural improvements, but of course they're actually meant to open Ukraine's economy to Western capital. Beyond the theater of anti-corruption campaigns, the EU's structural demands and the Putin-Trump resource grabs reveal a shared goal among all three entities: the literal extraction of value from Ukraine. This exploitation has exacerbated Ukraine's economic collapse. Hyperinflation and the collapse of Ukrainian currency has left the country in a precarious position. Regardless of what the assorted state and corporate propaganda would have you believe, a large part of why Ukraine is suffering this treatment is the West's and Russia's desire for control of the global supply chain for critical minerals. China currently controls 74% of global cobalt refining capacity, and the Democratic Republic of Congo supplies 66% of the world's cobalt. Both Russia and the West would really like a piece of the pie, and it just so happens there's a significantly weakened country that holds the keys. But forget shiny rocks and financial figures. We need to consider the human side of this conflict. The war has, as all wars do, precipitated a humanitarian catastrophe in the region. Mass migration has strained neighboring countries like Poland and Romania, while eastern Ukrainian migration into Russia proper erodes Ukrainian cultural identity in the region. The war has displaced at least 6.5 million people, creating a shortage of agricultural labor and leading to the abandonment of arable land. This disruption not only affects Ukraine, but also has ripple effects across the global food supply chain, particularly in the regions already vulnerable to food insecurity. Ukraine's centralized systems for water, sewage, and heating are on the brink of collapse. The knock-on effects of power cuts, like freezing and bursting pipes, leave millions without heat and threaten widespread waterborne diseases. A harsh winter could force millions more to seek refuge across Europe, though with sufficient international support, this scenario could yet be avoided. Both the West's and Russia's strategy to dismantle Ukrainian sovereignty includes fragmenting the state into competing political entities. The Kremlin envisions an expanded Donetsk and Luhansk under direct control, alongside a pro-Russian or at least Euro-neutral Kyiv administration, while a Western-aligned West Ukraine anchored in Lviv retains access to strategic ports like Odessa. To legitimize this, both sides have proposed deploying an international force in strictly delineated areas to oversee what's left of Ukraine, casting what is effectively foreign occupation from both ends as multilateral peacekeeping. Zelensky's loose authority, already strained by wartime pressures, has fractured further under US coercion. During his visit with the Trump admin, he faced demands to prioritize mineral concessions without security guarantees. His reluctance to surrender Ukraine's natural resources on the spot, despite enthusiastic privatization and wholesaling throughout the war, led to a public clash with Trump, culminating in his abrupt and humiliating dismissal from the White House, more proof of Kyiv's subordination to the United States. The U.S. Treasury Secretary reinforced this by declaring that it is, quote, impossible to have an economic deal without a peace deal, implying aid will be tied to political compliance. The main risk Russia faces for their plan is a Ukrainian insurgency with a formalized strategy outlined in the US-backed resistance operating concept, which prioritizes decentralized guerrilla warfare over conventional confrontation. Developed through multinational planning sessions since 2018, the framework draws on Cold War-era intelligence networks, emphasizing stealth, sabotage, and asymmetrical strikes. CIA paramilitary training, initiated after Crimea's annexation, expanded covertly to avoid escalation, with elite Ukrainian units mastering tactics like drone warfare and targeted assassinations. Ukraine is using some of these tactics now, but would likely escalate in the event of a crippling and unpopular peace deal. However, at this point, we can only speculate since ceasefire talks are in their infancy, and Ukraine's military is still intact and fighting, for the most part, a modern conventional war. Ukraine's sovereignty is eroded by the competing imperial agendas of the US, EU, and of course, Russia. Washington has been exerting its hegemony behind the scenes, exemplified by UK Prime Minister Starmer's concession that post-war planning, quote, needs to be done in conjunction with the United States, with daily coordination between their respective security advisors. Trump's ambivalence has fractured the faltering Western unity on Ukraine, and positioned Ukraine as a mere bargaining chip in US-Russia relations. European leaders, wary of Washington's wavering commitment, struggle to reconcile humanitarian rhetoric with limited military capacity. The landscape of a post-war Ukraine hinges on these competing pressures from Europe, the US, and Russia. With the US security guarantee for Europe on shaky ground, experts argue that strategic autonomy, led by the EU, may be critical to, quote, deterring further Russian aggression. But that logic is part of why we got here in the first place. What's more, it risks leaving Ukraine dependent on fragmented European leadership. Kyiv's alignment could tilt toward the EU if Western unity holds, as emphasized by Lviv's deputy mayor, who frames the problem in a very Bush-era manner, saying, quote, "You're either with Ukraine or you're with Russia. Basically, with us or against us." US concessions during peace talks, including territorial compromises and restrictions on military aid, have already weakened Ukraine's negotiating position against Russian demands for demilitarization and formal neutrality. Some analysts warn that delayed Western weapons deliveries and Trump's eagerness to wrap up the war could result in Ukraine ceding the Donbass entirely. Alternatively, a pro-Russian government might emerge if war fatigue and Western abandonment erode public trust, particularly if Kyiv is coerced into territorial concessions. Ukraine's post-war economy faces a grim choice: integrate fully into Western markets, or be relegated to just a source of cheap labor. But this might also be a distinction without a difference. Germany's deindustrialization and severed ties with Russia and China could drive Europe to exploit Ukraine as a source of low-wage labor rather than rebuilding its industrial base. Reconstruction funds, tied to EU regulatory control and US military oversight, would further cement Ukraine's role as a US client state characterized by limited sovereignty and dependency on Western aid. Long-term Western failures to provide a coherent strategy have left Ukraine economically vulnerable, which some argue was the point, with Latvian officials noting that insufficient support prevented, quote, "any sense of certainty in countering Russia." Without a shift in policy, Ukraine's industries will likely be dismantled or repurposed for Western capitals' needs. Finally, we can't underestimate Russia's upper hand in negotiations. Beyond their gains in territory, their capacity to regroup militarily could force Ukraine into a protracted war. Everything else aside, what is abundantly clear is that Ukraine does not hold its fate in its own hands. There are vultures circling, and the details of the ending aren't nearly as impactful as how we got here. The future remains uncertain, but Ukraine has lost more than all the rest involved, encouraged by the vain geopolitical interest of Western capital and the security maintenance of their largest neighbor. Only peace can lead to a productive future.